Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Abbott here. This is our Sonata Allegro worksheet. So we want to start off talking about this as pop music, not necessarily as some stuffy old piece that you hear every time you go to the symphony. I would suggest that the majority of the people sitting in the audience when this piece was performed in 1808 knew what was going on. They understood exactly what the form was. Now, the majority of the people sitting in the audience hearing this piece don't know what the form is. And that's why this is about Sonata Allegro form. It actually is a pop form that most people understood. And I think that if you understand the form, you'll listen to it differently. And if nothing else, you'll listen to it longer because you know where it's going. Let's start with talking about a symphony first. How many movements does a symphony have? 4 movements, and they're 4 separate movements. Number 2, the symphony is actually derived from earlier dance forms that were linked together. And eventually, the music became undanceable. So if you can imagine now going to a concert of Latin music, and you would sit in the audience, everyone would be very quiet, turn their cell phones off, everyone would have to be well-dressed, and perhaps a little older. They would start off with salsa. You would look around and nobody would move. No one would start to dance. That would be very strange. Then the next movement would be rumba. So rumba would be a slow movement. And the third movement would be some sort of norteño, tejano waltz. And the fourth movement would be a very fast merengue, but nobody would dance at all. This is basically what happened to the symphony. It started out as a series of 4 dance movements. So when people went out to dance to the first dance, they knew what's coming in the second dance, the third dance, and the fourth dance. So they stayed out. 50, 100 years from now, if this happened, you would be shocked. But at this point, so much time has passed that everyone just assumes that you don't dance to a symphony. And so less people listen to it and less people go to hear it, simply because the physicality is gone. I would also make a point of saying that people don't understand the rules of the game. So the first movement, this Sonata Allegro movement that we're speaking of, it's the same as if you went to a cricket match or a soccer match. You understand the physicality of what the players are doing, but you really don't understand what the rules are. When someone scores a goal, everybody starts screaming. You don't know why they did or how they did or what it means. Same thing happens here. If you don't understand the way that the game is being played in Sonata Allegro, you're basically going to get lost, confused, and uninterested. And uninterested means today you're going to look at your cell phone, you're checking out, you're wondering why you're here, and how much time is left. A modern-day comparison to this, and number 3, is jazz, because jazz started as a music for people to dance to. It was very physical. Now people go to a jazz concert at the Lincoln Jazz Center, they cross their hands and act very quietly, and they go, yes, yes, that's wonderful, but they don't get physically involved, so less people are listening to it. The majority of first movements in this particular era, in the classical era, which is 1715 to 1825, started with Sonata Allegro form. And this is because Franz Joseph Haydn, who wrote 104 symphonies, and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who wrote 41 symphonies, their symphonies started first movement Sonata Allegro form. And Beethoven followed those 2 giants. As a matter of fact, Beethoven and Mozart studied with Haydn. So Beethoven follows the rules for most of the time. As his symphonies begin to evolve, he stops following the rules. And this is why Beethoven is so important. He basically breaks all the rules. Number 5, our example here, Beethoven's 5th Symphony, first movement marked allegro. Allegro means fast. Con brio means with life. So fast with life. But does this mean that they're not telling you what it is? Absolutely. Do composers like Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven give descriptive names to their movements in this era? No. They would not want you to have any prior idea of what this was going to be. This is one of the big aspects of listening to classical music, or any kind of music that doesn't have words. Any kind of music that does not paint a picture for you, you are asked to paint your own picture. One noticeable characteristic of this era, what I call columns that represent the classical era architecture. A column in music is called a cadence, and this resembles the punctuation that you hear in language, commas, periods, semicolons. The simplest way to take a look at this is for me to play the very ending of the Beethoven, which ends. Every one of these chords that I hit is the equivalent of a column of a Greek-inspired building, as you see here. Column, column, column. And this could be the end. A column or a cadence that ends where you want it to end is called a regular cadence, and a cadence that doesn't go where you think it's going to go is called a deceptive cadence. Oops, I must not be done yet. A simple way to appreciate this. Here's my take on how to do this, how to musically appreciate a piece like this, or any kind of music that is instrumental in nature. Create a movie in your mind. You're excellent movie makers. You've heard thousands of movies with music. And that is what basically I want you to think about. When you hear music that doesn't tell you what it is, you create in your own mind what you think it is. That is what the great composers of this era wanted you to do. They would never insult you by telling you what was going on. Now, this movement is also a very important part of Western culture. Example, the letter V in Morse code is short, 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 long. Da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da is the letter V. Now, Morse code was not invented in Beethoven's time, but V stood for victory, so that the British, you will constantly see Churchill doing this. So da-da-da-da meant victory during World War II to the British. Beethoven, of course, had no idea that this was even a possibility. So you can see how the particular music or the particular theme of this music, which is short, 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 long, actually is translated into hundreds of years later for different cultural reasons. And the reasons that we'll look at are down at the bottom, cultural references, number 20. To think about this in terms of how you're going to listen to it, the first thing is to break the sections down. The overall structure of Sonata allegro form is A, B, and A. So A implies something, B is something different, and A, it comes back to the original. Okay, you're going to find that many, many pop tunes follow this as well. The first section of the form is called the exposition. Of course, that is where the general ideas are exposed to you. The second section is called the development. Those ideas are developed. The final section is called the recapitulation, or we'll call it the recap. So you basically have a series of ideas, they're developed, and then you hear them again. And the audience is quite aware of this and follows this game. However, if you're not done yet as the composer, if you said, okay, I've played the game, but I'm still not done yet, you can add an extra section which is called a coda, and a coda in Italian is tail. What this means is that a lot of composers from this era had no problem following the rules, but they exploded inside of the rules. So if you think every work of art, for instance, every painting has a frame. A frame tells you the limitations. It's either a very small frame or a very large frame. Composers had no problem working inside the frame this time, but they also exploded with magnificent ideas inside of that frame. And then eventually the coda became where a lot of the extra work was. And Beethoven is the person, his codas became very long. He exploded the frame in general. How many themes? Oh, this must be very difficult because it's European classical music. There must be 20 themes. There's only 2 themes. One will separate from the other. It'll be so different that you'll have to think this must be the new theme. And the way that we'll break those down is we'll call the first theme the heroic theme, ba 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 ba, and we'll call the second theme the love theme, ba da 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 da. There's your first theme. Beethoven stops. Okay. We're still the first theme, but at the da. Watch how it stops. Here, French horns, and then just the love theme. The feeling changes completely. And that is the key. The audience is going, that must be the second thing. Now, this material is called transition material. It sort of flies around a little bit into this. It's important in transition material to realize that it's going somewhere. And here's where this is going. Right back to the beginning again. So literally the musicians go back to the beginning of the music and read it again. So Beethoven is repeating his exposition. That's pop. Beethoven is saying, look, if you want to double check your themes, I'm going to go back and do it again for you. All right, so now that you know the game here, let's see if you can identify where the second theme comes in. So raise your hand, however you want to do this. That must be it. Now, the fact of the matter is, you're like 2 minutes into this already, and you're still figuring you know where you are. So the important aspect of this is that you know where you are. You haven't lost interest yet because you're following the game. Here's the transition material again. And you must be thinking, all right, well, this is the exact same thing. This must be leading to the development. I wonder what he's going to develop, the first theme or the second theme. Well, I've never really heard it that way. He's developing the first theme. Now, what's important here is that this is the equivalent of a great jazz player or a great rock guitarist taking an improvisation over the chords of the verse in a pop song. This is exactly what's happening. Beethoven is a great improviser, and so instead of actually playing it, he wrote it down. This is a written down improvisation. Otherwise, we wouldn't hear it. We wouldn't be able to hear his great improvisation. There was no recordings, so maybe when he performed this on the piano live, he went completely off in the development. In this case, he wrote it down, and then what happens, as does most great music, people take little pieces of it and are inspired by little pieces and are inspired by the little pieces. So that's, which I call the breaths. Listen. I've heard that before. He leaves a space. If I hear that love theme, I'm going to know that I am in the recap now. At this wonderful moment with the oboe, which is called a cadenza. I said, everybody take a breath. Okay, here we go. If I hear that second theme, I know where we are. This could be it. Here's the moment. out. There it is. So I know I'm in the recap. Now, possibly there's a coda coming up. So we'll see. If there's a coda, it'll make it sound like it's going to be the end of the piece, but he'll deceptively move to something else. So I'm not done yet. It goes. Transition material here. Here comes the columns. Oh, he's not done. By the way, that's material from the development. Okay, so he's going right back into a lot of his development material. At this point, we're 7 minutes, like 7.5 minutes into this. Okay, this could be it. Ba-da-ba-bum. Ooh, just like the beginning. The end. Could be the end. Could be the end. Be the end. End. It was the end. Excellent. So there it is. Not to say that you should all of a sudden love this. That's not what music appreciation is. But to understand it and to explain it to yourself and to someone else. And then it starts to catch on. If Beethoven came back, he'd have to figure out the form of rap. He'd figure it out pretty fast, but it would not be a form that he was familiar with. How does Beethoven let you know, after hearing this, that each section is starting? He leaves these huge gaps. He actually stops, and then something else happens. Isn't that pop? And it's a great idea because the audience then registers everything that just happened, and it gives them an opportunity to sort of file it in their mind, like, okay, I got that. Now what? That's how the exposition resembles pop music, because as we've said, the exposition is repeated the same way that you can hear someone play the verse and the chorus of a song and then go back and do the verse and chorus of the song all over again, as if to say, I want to make sure you have this before the guitar solo starts. And then when they come back, they could come back with the verse and the chorus again, which would be the recap. All right, one little trick here, number 19. Because there's 4 movements, as great as this first movement was, you don't want to applaud between it. Because the tradition, and by the way, if you want to applaud, go ahead. But the tradition is to wait until the final movement, which sometimes is also in Sonata allegro form, but is also usually marked presto, fast. This is the one that's supposed to get you out of your seat and applaud. So you may be the only one, hey, that was great, and everybody's looking at you, and that depends on how self-confident you are. I don't care. So if that's the way you feel about it, great. But the tradition, and people would go, oh, I've never been to a symphony before, I see. But that was the tradition, was to wait till all 4 and then applaud. Some cultural references I want you to look at in this. Fantasia, which is the Walt Disney version, a 1999 digital version that uses the heroic theme as some sort of Genesis creation, some sort of God creator, and then the love theme as a mommy butterfly with her baby. So follow that, and you can see how they told you what it was supposed to be, and unfortunately, you may never hear it again the same way because the visual will be planted in your head, and that's what really has hurt music from the European classical tradition, is what Walt Disney and Warner Brothers did. They basically took all this great music and put Bugs Bunny characters or Yosemite Sam. They put characters and storylines to all this. So that's what happens in Fantasia. The other one is a disco version from the 1970s. So you'll take a look at that, and then you'll see how they use that version in an episode of Family Guy. Some of the other things I want you to take a look at is called line riders. So put Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in and line riders, and you'll see how they give you an example of how this works with a pen going through lines. That's a very interesting way of doing it. You can also see light representations of this. Another version that I like to suggest is the Yngwie Malmsteen heavy metal version of this. He's a guitar god. So take a heavy metal band with a very distorted guitar with a whole lot of extra notes and see what he does with it. And then you'll see the David Garrett version of this. David Garrett on violin doing sort of a primal drum thing behind it. Now notice what they're going to do. There's salsa versions and all of their versions. But notice what they'll do. They usually just use the first theme. They usually don't go into the second theme. But it was also very typical as we got through the classical into the romantic for pop songs to be the second theme. So there is our Sonata Allegro worksheet. Please fill it out, send it back to me, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon.